Good morning and welcome to this UNMISS press conference. It's our periodic opportunity to update you and to catch up and to hear your concerns. I especially welcome everyone joining us live on Radio Miraya. I've just returned to Juba from a series of diplomatic engagements in Ethiopia, Djibouti, Kenya, and South Africa in its capacity as chair of the C5 group of countries appointed by the African Union to deal with South Sudan. During these visits, my goal was to encourage regional support and international partnerships for South Sudan ahead of its first post-independence elections scheduled for, as you're aware, December next year, 2024. Let me share that I had constructive engagements with the Secretary General Special Envoy for the Horn of Africa, with principals from the neighbouring member states, with the African Union and with IGAD, and at the African Union Peace and Security Council, I urged South Sudan's partners to work with a shared sense of purpose, commitment, and unified messaging so as to maximise our leverage in the interests of South Sudan. I use this opportunity to call upon IGAD to convene a discussion on South Sudan and assist the parties to resolve the outstanding contentious hurdles standing in the way of the implementation of the peace process, and to enable all member states to align their support accordingly. The feedback I received during my visit is clear. While there remains much international goodwill towards South Sudan, partners are looking to its leaders and more broadly to its political class to translate this moment of truth into a vision of shared peace and prosperity for all. Closing this gap requires the collective imagination and a spirit of practical compromise amongst all the parties to the revitalized peace agreement. In that regard, UNMISS welcomes the reconstitution of the National Elections Commission, the Political Parties Council, and the National Constitutional Review Commission. But announcements and appointments are not enough. These bodies need to be resourced and operationalized urgently so as to execute their mandate. I encourage the government to address concerns about gender and political representation, given that the credibility of these institutions rests on the trust and confidence of the public that they serve. Let me underscore that elections are not a one-day event, but a process that incorporates deliberate and thoughtful decisions before, during, and after the polls. All these processes must have the full buy-in and support of the South Sudanese, and especially in the case of a country emerging from divisive conflict. This is a whole of society effort which requires mutually reinforcing participation of political parties, civil society, faith-based leaders, security institutions, and the transitional leadership. These processes are dependent on an open political and civic space for all. In fact, this is the difference between a nation-building moment, which the elections could represent, or a catastrophe. Today, the honest assessment of many observers and stakeholders is that the current political and civic operating space does not offer a level playing field. Therefore, it's imperative for the parties to agree on a code of conduct around free, fair, and transparent competition. UNMISS cautions against the temptation towards unilateral actions that undermine the trust that is needed amongst all stakeholders. Similarly, political parties must be able to register and campaign without intimidation and fear, and South Sudan needs the active participation of civil society so that they, the civil society, can support civic education and function as monitors and observers of a credible process. The media must be able to report freely, accurately, in a balanced way, without censorship or threats. Looking ahead, it would be impossible to envisage free, fair and credible elections in December 2024 unless all South Sudanese parties, leaders and stakeholders grab the bull by the horns and agree on a critical mass of decisions by the first quarter of 2024. At the end of this year, the Secretary General will be reporting to the Security Council on progress towards peaceful elections, the criteria for which should reflect the will and consensus of the South Sudanese themselves, and not a set of externally driven conditions, that is, externally driven by the UN. These are conditions agreed to by the South Sudanese themselves. The costs of inaction are clear. South Sudan remains in a state of humanitarian emergency, and conditions are expected to deteriorate in 2024 due to funding shortages, and I can share that UN agencies and other humanitarian partners are overwhelmed and struggling to respond to people in need. Moreover, the increasing impact of climate change is felt by the poorest and most vulnerable South Sudanese. And the conflict in Sudan itself, to the north of us, has added to this complexity. To date, more than 373,000 people, returnees and refugees, have fled to South Sudan. In these difficult times, when humanitarian assistance is increasingly challenging, aid workers remain on the front lines of providing life-saving support to the most vulnerable people in South Sudan, including children. Yet, South Sudan remains one of the deadliest environments for humanitarians to operate in, and I condemn in the strongest terms attacks against aid workers in South Sudan, which only prevents assistance from reaching those in need. I note the responsibility of the government at all levels to protect humanitarian personnel and assets, and I share in that responsibility and commit the UN to doing what we can do to ensure there is access to humanitarian aid. Most recently, we've been concerned by reports. This leads me to the overall security situation, and clashes continue in parts of the country, with 77, that's nearly 80% of casualties between June and September attributed to community-based militias and civil defense groups. Most recently, we've been concerned by reports of violence in the Abyei administrative area and Warrap state, which has claimed at our count at least 75 lives in the last 2 weeks. Leaders of these communities need to recognize that repeated cycles of retaliatory violence are not going to solve their problems, and they need to use peaceful means to resolve the issues which divide them. I call upon the government to investigate these attacks and killings and to do what is necessary to reduce tensions between the affected communities. UNMISS will continue to deploy our blue helmets within our capacity and resources for the protection of citizens and in support of state authorities in discharging their duties to the population. But we cannot be everywhere all at once. And that's why it's critical for the government to finalize the transitional security arrangements. Security, stability and the protection of human rights are non-negotiable tenets in the social contract between a government and its citizens. It is in this regard we're encouraged by the recent deployment of 750 personnel of the necessary unified forces to Tonga in Upper Nile. They are part of the 52,000 graduates from phase 1 of the training and deployment of the NUF. UNMISS was pleased to provide aviation support for this deployment. We believe that phase 2 of these deployments, with an eventual total number of 83,000 graduates deployed across the country, will go a long way to enhancing confidence in the government and providing security for the elections. Meanwhile, UNMISS remains concerned that military defections threaten and undermine the much-needed trust between the parties, one of the critical lessons from the conflict in Sudan is that a country should have a single and unified security apparatus. Listeners, please allow me to convey some concrete recommendations of the trilateral mechanism. That's the mechanism which brings together the United Nations, IGAD, and the African Union. We urge the government to allocate the necessary funds for the swift operationalization of key institutions, and we encourage dialogue amongst all leaders to address pending technical, legal, and operational decisions that are needed for the elections to take place on time. In that regard, we presented 10 priority issues for the consideration of the government and relevant parties to assist them to frame the discussion on these critical issues. We strongly support action in this endeavour. Let me recall that the signing of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, the CPA, in 2005 marked the end of one long struggle, and it appears the start of another. Children born in that fateful year are now 18 years old, the legal voting age in South Sudan. And yet these new citizens do not know when, where, or how they will be able to exercise their birthright and whether they will be able to do so in safety. This presents a tough hill to climb, but it is not insurmountable. Let's work together to honour the sacrifices of your founding mothers and fathers who envisaged a peaceful, prosperous and democratic future for all. UNMISS remains with you in this journey. Thank you for your listening. I'll now take some questions.